Okay, good afternoon. Before we kick off, I want to start with one of the last slides, other Rev sessions today. So there's an architecture session following the deep dive where we're going to dig into the components inside Rev and some of the underlying architecture. We've got a great session on API and command lines, so scripting and automation later on today. I would skip the expert panel because this guy has no idea what he's talking about. And I know he doesn't for sure. There's a KVM update tomorrow. Dawn Bhavna, who product manager and managed engineering team, are going to go through all the low-level features that the Rev team will take credit for later. And then some customer perspectives on Rev. Okay, so back to the top. My name's Andrew Cathrow, so when I say that guy did not know what he was talking about, I can say that for sure. I look after product management along with some of my teammates who are in the room today. And Itamar is the director of engineering on the Rev team. I want to start with 20,000-foot view of what Rev is, and then dig down into some details on the storage, the networking, and the platform itself. Anybody here not know what Rev is? Do you work for Red Hat? But I'm sure some of my colleagues here don't either. So if somebody asked me really quickly for a quick answer that I never give, I would say, what is Rev? It's an open source competitor to vSphere. So vSphere is a management platform. Rev Manager manages the hypervisor. And KVM is the underlying hypervisor competing with ESX. So we give you the management platform with a GUI. I mean, there's a command line and API if you so require. But command line, graphical interface API, high-level features such as live migration, high availability, snapshots, templates, cloning, etc. So RHEL includes KVM. So you got all you need to run virtual machines in RHEL, but you get maybe more than you need. So a RHEL installation, I'm sure you all know how to make a really lean and mean RHEL installation, but it still may be a gigabyte or more in size. So Rev Hypervisor is a small footprint version of RHEL with just enough RHEL to boot up on all the hardware we support in RHEL 6, run virtual machines, run our management agent. I don't need drivers for wireless or infrared or any consumer hardware. I don't need Perl. I should argue that no one needs Perl. I don't need... Oh, what are 2 boos? That's good. Doors over there. Don't need Perl, don't need X, so just enough to boot up, run virtual machines. It's compatible with all the server hardware that RHEL's compatible with, so there's no separate HCL. If you can work on RHEL 6, it will work on the Rev Hypervisor. I think we'll skip through the management features, and let's dig down to the infrastructure, and I'll give you Itamar.
Hi, everyone. We'll start with covering some of the infrastructural features and technologies in 3.1. So first of all, Overt. When we released Rev 3.0, after we converted it from 2.2 C# to Java in 3.0, we also open sourced it under the Overt umbrella. Overt to Rev is like Fedora to RHEL. We released it in 3.0. In 3.1, it's actually based on the upstream Overt project. So we're rebasing from upstream, and upstream we're releasing 3.1 about now. For what we call downstream, for Rev, the product side of the house, we backport patches, make it sure it's robust and tested before we release it for customers for a few more months. That's one of the main differences between the two. One of the benefits of this being open source, and this is Red Hat, no need to cover that too much, others can contribute features as well. For example, in 3.1, we'll get a feature that IBM contributed for support of IBM Tivoli directory for authentication and authorization. So we get that as part of contributions to the product in the community. 3.1 comes with the web admin. We no longer have the C#-based client we had in 3.0. We released the web admin in 3.0 as a tech preview. In 3.1, that's the only admin. Same user experience as the WPF1 had. Actually same code base behind the scenes. Works on both Linux with Firefox and Windows with Internet Explorer based on Google Web Toolkit technology. So you can now do everything. I'm kind of proud of that yet now you no longer, we basically lost all the legacy that we had on requiring Windows components, and now everything runs on Linux. In 3.1, you can get the user interface in multiple languages. So both labels and error messages are now being localized to multiple languages. It's going to be based on the locale your browser sends, but you can change that if you want to have a different language. And we're also doing localization for a lot of documentation. We have a lot of books coming with Rev. They're being deployed as RPM as part of the product, so you can browse them as HTMLs. They're also available online in the Red Hat site. And you're going to be able to view the documentation based on your locale. The help, the documentation, can also be arrived from the various dialogues in the product. So when you're standing on a dialogue, there's a help button. That's true in 3.0 as well. If you'll click on that, it will point you to the right place in the documentation. So it's context-sensitive help. And now it's going to be in the language that matches your definition. We moved from JBoss EAP 5 to JBoss EAP 6. So just released JBoss EAP 6. Basically faster, better on memory consumption, faster startup, so all good there. We're also moving to OpenJDK 7, so we're leaving another kind of a legacy proprietary technology. In 3.0, we're still using the now Oracle Jerry. 3.1 is entirely open source technologies. We're upgrading the reports component. We're using Jaspersoft report subsystem for various business intelligence and reports in the product. So we're upgrading to their newly released 4.7 version. And we also did another step. In 3.0, you can install it, but it has a different user interface. In 3.1, we started merging them together. So now you can go stand on an object, almost any object, right-click, choose reports. In this case, I'm standing on a data center, and I can choose show reports. I get a list of all the reports I can get on a data center. Same goes for a host, standing on a host, various reports. Nice thing is if I choose two hosts and I choose to show a report, it will show me a report showing the trend comparing those two hosts. And that goes on to various entities as well. So the reports are now integrated into the product, giving you much easier way to use them. We also did some single sign-on between them, so it's the same authentication to both systems. We also added a dashboard, so when you're standing on the system level or a specific data center or a cluster, going to the dashboard tab, this comes from the reporting model. So again, these are dashboards coming from Jasper Reports. You can get an overview of the status of that specific entity in the system. All the reports come from what we call the history data warehouse. So we have RevM running on the operational database, and all the time we copy the data to a historical database that keeps history of configurational changes and statistics, and the reports are based on that. We made some improvements to the installation process. The installation process is a script that you run, asks you a few questions, and installs everything on the product. We now support the default HTTP and HTTPS ports. We do that by doing an Apache mod proxy front-ending JBoss, so now we can use those lower ports. We added support for remote Postgres database. A lot of customers asked us to be able to install the engine and the database on two separate machines, sometimes for better performance and scalability, sometimes because there's a DBA managing and maintaining that database. So now you can install the engine on one server and the database on another one. We also added, we found out that sometimes it's a bit hard to install the system. You need at least 2 nodes, one for the engine, one for servers. Not all the time it's easy to find them. So we added a plugin to the installer that if you install it, it's an RPM. Everything is RPMs, of course. So when you install it, it changes a bit the flow of the installer, making it a bit easier to install everything on the same host. So you can take a single host, run this installation on it. It will make sure that it has VDSM and the engine on the same host, configuring everything. So once you finish the installation, you can add a virtual machine. You don't need any further steps after running this installation. It's going to use that box local storage out of the box. You can later do everything you want with it, add other hosts, etc. But for a simple installation on POC, it's very easy to use. Because we want to make sure that the installation goes as smoothly as possible, the installation will verify that it's going to succeed. So it will check that we have virtualization extensions enabled on the host, so it actually can be used as a hypervisor in Rev. And it will, let's zoom that, ask you a few more questions. Do you want to configure VDSM, our host agent, on this host? Which path do you want to use for local storage? And just confirm the root password. So 3 additional questions, normal installation flow of the product, and then we have in the output a few more steps. We created the storage directory, so we created the place to put the storage images on. We created the entities needed to bootstrap the work in the system, a data center, a cluster, and we added that server as a host inside the system, created a storage domain, attached it, activated it. A few operations that are easier now for POCs because you get it out of the box when you install this all at once. We added tasks to the system, so now you can see what's going on in the system. So what kind of tasks are running in the background or just finished. So for example, if I added a host, I can now see the various tasks and their steps and their status. So adding a storage domain, I have a lot of steps. This is the current step that's running. It's still running, and now it finished. We have the time, so we can see what other users, as an admin, what tasks other user initiated in the system, what's happening in the background as a running task right now. In 3.0, we introduced our REST API to the system. You can do anything you can do from the UI through the API as well. In 3.1, we're introducing the Python SDK and CLI for Linux, so you don't have to use the REST API directly. You can easily, it's much easier to write a Python program at least using the Python SDK, or you don't even have to do that. You want to write a simple script, you can use the shell or the CLI to do that. I'm not going to cover that too deeply because there's a full session afterwards just on this topic. We did add a few more features to that. You can now, in 3.0, only an admin could use the REST API. In 3.1, a user can use it as well. They're limited to see the entities that they have user permissions on. We improved a bit the performance we found out for some of the 3.0 API consumers that when they use it intensively, they don't want the authentication to happen each time they do it. So we introduced sessions for credentials. It doesn't change the REST semantics for all those that care about REST being stateless. Everything is still stateless except for the authentication, which we can do only once. And we are also introducing JSON serialization, which is a bit more efficient than the XML default one that people can start consuming and use. The SDK is very easy to use. If you use an IDE, just IntelliSense, so you don't need to learn everything. It's going to basically tell you about itself. The CLI also, again, simple to use and has auto-completion help in it, just one-liners to create an entity, update one. So here, just update the VM with this name, change the description. It's going to do this. This is the output after the change. Listing object, we're deleting them. Again, very easy to use. Full session on that afterwards at 4:50. Any questions on infra before I go on to storage. The all-in-one is, the question was, is all-in-one for POCs or for production as well? The intent of the all-in-one is to bootstrap POCs mostly because it configures the host, the engine, to also be used to run virtual machines and use the local disks to store them. So it's not, if you're going to deploy a data center, you're not going to do it that way. But to get a taste of it, it's very useful. So some new features in 3.1 around storage. We're introducing a new storage domain format level. In 3.0, we introduced format level 2. In 3.1, we're introducing format level 3 to get a few more features like live snapshot and SandLock. SandLock is our distributed locking mechanism for the shared storage we're using. We are also introducing an automatic upgrade, so you don't really need to care about the fact we're introducing a new storage domain level. Once you change a data center level to 3.1, RevM is going to upgrade automatically all your storage domain to that level to get benefit of those new features. We're adding support for NFS v4 for storage domain, for NFS storage domains. So now we can make use of NFS v4. And we also added auto-negotiate. So we can automatically detect if it's NFS v3 or v4 and connect accordingly. So you don't need to, again, you need to worry less about NFS issues. We also added the ability to configure. Sometimes you want to tweak NFS options. There's a red disclaimer here. Don't touch this unless you know what you're doing, changing the timeouts of NFS. We think our defaults are OK. But if you want to change them, you can. So you can change the number of retransmissions. And the timeout, which is in the very special measurement unit of deciseconds. We didn't want this, but this is how Mount wants. And we expect people to just copy what they see, what they have in Mount to us, so we kept this special measurement unit. We also added a new type of a storage domain called POSIXFS. So till now we had iSCSI, Fiber Channel, NFS, and local storage. Now we support any POSIX compliant file system, so you can now create a storage domain on top of a GPFS, GlusterFS, VXFS, so other POSIX compliant file system you can now be used to store virtual machines on. Anyone here knows what Gluster is? OK. So Gluster, Red Hat Storage, just been announced for another version of it, I think. So allows you to use hosts with their local storage as part of a single large storage array with a single namespace. So the nice thing about it is that you're using the RAID for some redundancy in the host. You can define replication to other hosts to get redundancy between hosts. And you can scale out as much as you want because you can always add more and more servers, each using their local storage. So that's kind of like a clustered file system, not getting into semantics between that. So the Gluster team actually is basing their management system on the same Overt one, so Red Hat Storage Console, going to basically look the same. It just has fewer tabs than us. But in RevM, we have both Rev and Gluster in the same system, so you can now create and manage Gluster clusters and servers, bricks, volumes, all the Gluster terminology if you're familiar with it. And just when you're creating cluster now, you can choose if you want to also have a Gluster service on it, and then you can create volumes, add bricks to those volumes, and use those volumes as POSIXFS storage domains. So it's a bit of an integrated solution to allow you to do both. This is tech preview in 3.1. Any questions?
On the storage 3.0 formats where automatically changes, if I'm upgrading from Rev 3.0 to 3.1, and then my storage format changes and something goes bad in the upgrade, how do I read the storage with my old Rev 3.0?
The upgrade will not finish if it did not succeed and verify the upgrade. So it's not going to upgrade your format level unless it succeeds to do it 3.1. And it will only start after you confirm that all your hosts in the data center are compatible with 3.1 in order to start that upgrade.
Have you added support for multiple storage types for data center?
Not yet. So in this version, no. Something we're still working on upstream. Watch it upstream.
How extensively has the upgrade from Rev 2.1 storage domains to Rev 3.1?
From 2.1? Well, from 2.2 to 3.0, we have a migration tool that you can download and do the upgrade. You need to move from 2.2 to 3.0 before you can upgrade to 3.1. Okay? Yes?
When you're talking about using the cluster, would that cluster be replicated or not?
The question was, is Gluster going to be replicated or not? That depends on how you're going to configure it. You can configure it any way you want, just distributed with replication, etc. That depends on you. You can use Gluster like a POSIX-FS even if you didn't configure it through the same user interface. So it's not a must to do it that way. A lot of questions on storage here.
Is there going to be a support for replication, right?
In Gluster, I suggest we defer the Gluster till we'll. Right now it's in tech preview. There's a lot of combinations you can do there. So we're going to see how we're going to support them going forward. I'll stop the question now and we'll move on and we'll go back to questions.
A few more slides on storage, and then if there's more Q&A around storage, we can do that then. Okay, so a lot more storage features in 3.1. So right now in 3.0, disks are managed as part of VMs. I look at a VM, I can see the disks that are attached to it. There's no overall view about what disks I have in the system. In 3.1, we've got a new tab on disks. It shows you all the disks configured in the system. You can drill down, look at the properties of each disk, the VMs they're attached to, create new disks independent of VMs. So now a disk is a separate entity. It's not dependent on any particular VM or template. Hot plug, one of the most commonly requested features we've got in Rev 3.0. So the ability to add a disk to a running virtual machine. Now to support this, we've got a concept of not just having a disk defined to a VM, but having one that's active. So we see that the add, edit, and remove are existing buttons from 3.0. Activate and deactivate. So I can have an element that's defined. So a disk that's defined as part of a VM, but it's not actually active. So the VM itself will not see that disk in the system. It means that I could add a disk, remove it while the VM is still running. I might decide that if I've got a VM where the storage domain fails, I want to start it without a disk, I can just deactivate that disk. So if I've got a running VM, I get the option to add a new disk to it. It can be a brand new disk that I'm creating myself, just for this VM, or it could be an existing disk that's already defined within Rev, one that's maybe shared from another VM, a LUN, or another disk that's been previously defined. So again, that can be added, either offline or online to the VM, hot plugged while the VM is running. So today, all the storage goes through this storage domain, like a storage pool. But there's use cases where you don't want Rev to manage your storage. Maybe it's a database and you've got a table space on a LUN. It'd be accessed from a virtual machine and from a physical machine. So with the direct LUN, you can now directly connect an iSCSI or fiber channel LUN to a virtual machine. So then the UI that you define the VM, so define the direct LUN. There could be fiber channel. You'd see when you pick a host you want to use to browse the LUNs, or if it's iSCSI, you put in your target details, authentication, get a list of the LUNs, add that into the disk store. And then that appears now as a disk. So back in that high-level disks tab, you saw a list of disks, and some little icons here, and there's a new icon here for direct LUN. So that's an external unmanaged disk. Is a limitation on the number of disks you can have attached. So right now, we're using Virtio block as a backend within KVM, and there's a limit on how many PCI slots you can have. So each Virtual block device, be that a direct LAN or otherwise, is a PCI slot. So you get to a limit. I think once we take away all the mandatory components that we have, the bridges, the VGA card, you've about 28 PCI slots to play with. There's a new, per virtual machine. There's a new feature coming in RHEL called Virtual SCSI. It's a power virtualized SCSI controller, and it breaks that limitation. It's tech preview in 6.3, be coming into 6.4. So right now, depending on how many NICs and other devices you have, 20-ish per virtual machine. Yes?
Will you eventually support the SRIOV or MRIOV that controllers adapters?
So SRIOV, if you've not come across it, it's an intelligent PCI card. It can split itself into multiple virtual PCI cards. So today, that's supported by KVM and libvirt. We have a notion called hooks that I'll come on to, and I'll show you how we can support that through a hook in about 20 slides or so. Just one more. Yeah, so we support multipath for fiber and Verizon SCSI, yes. Okay, so shared disk. We had an enforcement mechanism in Rev 3, which I think was really arbitrary, that a disk can only be accessed concurrently by a single VM. Now we have a property on a disk that said it's shareable. Cute little sharing icon here. And when you define or edit a disk, you've got a shareable flag to define it that is allowed to be shared between multiple VMs. Obviously, permissions still apply. So a storage domain is a pool of storage. A storage domain could be an export from NFS. It could be one or more LUNs. But you're restricted in Rev 3 today that one VM can only access one storage domain. You can define multiple ones, but you can't mix and match. In 3.1, we have the ability to have a single VM that has multiple storage domains. Maybe my system disk is on a slow array, and I'm using a fast array for my data disk. Or that could be part of a migration strategy. The question, can you mix iSCSI NFS fiber channel? No, in Rev 3.1, we don't support mixed storage domains. That's a feature we're looking at for what we will have for Rev 4. One point about that, if you do have a use case where you're NFS, but you really do want to have an iSCSI on a fiber channel LUN for this one use case, direct LUN doesn't limit you. So if I had an NFS storage pool, I could still use iSCSI or fiber channel with a direct LUN. So live snapshots, so the ability to take a running virtual machine. In Rev 3 and KVM prior to 6.3, it was an offline feature, and take a snapshot of the VM, particular point in time. So we've got a new user interface where you see the list of the snapshots. You can draw down, look at the configuration, what applications are installed, what NICs, what disks in the snapshot. You can also take a snapshot, actually clone the VM from a snapshot. Let's say you had a running virtual machine in production, something wasn't looking quite right. Take a snapshot and then clone that virtual machine. And the next step from the clone, if you wanted to change the configuration, maybe put it on a different logical network, on your QA network, you can do that again, all from a live running VM.
Is that done by the hardware, or is that done by software?
Today, that's done by software. So there's work going on upstream to do storage integration to allow the snapshotting to be performed, and other options like cloning, which is very expensive, to be performed by the storage array, not by the software. Storage live migration or vMotion, I think the #1 most requested feature. I actually have an email rule to delete those emails from my inbox now, there's so many of them. So I think it's the biggest feature gap we've had historically between ESX and KVM. It's a new feature going in right now. It's classified as tech preview for RHEL 6.3 on a 6.4 host. We'll promote that to fully supported. So the idea now is I've got a virtual machine and the storage is on storage domain 1. That's the legacy array. I want to move that to the second array. Maybe it's part of migration, it's for performance. But rather than waiting for a downtime, a maintenance window, and then copying 3 terabytes of per VM across, as it's running, we have a simple button, move the disk, and as it's running, Under the covers, we're creating a snapshot, some mirroring writes, but the net effect is what you see is your VM continues to run, and we're moving the storage from storage domain 1 to storage domain 2 with no loss of service to the VM.
If you're connected to a common SAN, you don't need to do that, correct?
Yeah. So KVM, one of the principles of KVM is if the hardware can do it, it should do it. Right? KVM's always been around, that kind of pragmatism and offloading to the hardware. So if you've got that backend feature in your SAN, use the backend feature in your SAN. But if I want to go between this SAN and this SAN, and then you haven't got that feature. And a lot of work's been done both on the management tier and also lower in RHEL, a library called lib storage management that abstracts some storage operations that it'd be to offload those to the array. If I want to clone a disk image, it's a lot better for the array to clone that than for me to read a block, write a block, read a block, write a block. One of the features that we haven't got on the deep dive, but we mentioned on the roadmap, is doing plugins for Rev 3.2. One of the first plugins that's been written actually by NetApp is a plugin to do cloning and the array integration in the UI. So if you had the NetApp file, you wanted to do rapid cloning, it would be faster doing it with the storage array than me copying blocks around.
Is that done in real time? Meaning, if you plan to do a quote in motion, can you like stage it ahead of time so that they're always replicated?
Let me see if I understand the question. So, so if I plan to do the storage live migration, so I can do that at any time that Kev is on running. There's no loss of service. If I wanted to schedule that, I've got the command line, and I just do a cron job, and it will run at that specific time. But
Say clone and then do a move later.
well, it would do it live. There's no need to separate it. So.
Okay.
We've got a feature in Rev 3 called the Storage Pool Manager. So it's a node that handles leases and locking for the storage. So if you're used to the Rev UI, there'd be an SPM role in one of the columns. The SPM is a critical node, and we make sure that service is always running on one node in the cluster. It does the extensions of logical volumes, it handles the locking mechanism. But there are cases where you may want to dedicate that to a certain set of nodes. So we've got some customers who want to say that only node A and B will be running the SPM, or we prefer these nodes to be dedicated to that role. So we've got a feature now where we can specify preference to which nodes have a priority to run the SPM. Now it's a numeric value, and in the API you can specify a never, but we're specifying a preference now in the UI. So I prefer this node to be the SPM by having a higher priority. Yes?
If the home with the SPM die while the manager is down with the election, yeah?
So if it's a double fault, a failure then a failure, then the RevM has to be highly available to come back up. So you need to have the RevM clustered to handle the double failure. Okay, any more storage questions?
Is it on the roadmap to allow expanding a disk live?
Everything's on the roadmap. Do you want to know when it's on the roadmap? Yes, it is. We're scoping right now, or coming up in 2 weeks' time, what we want to do internally and then as a community for 3.2. That feature is now in KVM, so we've got the low-level enabler. And so I'd like to say that could be something with 3.2. It would be premature to promise that now. It's not stopped me before, but it would be premature. Okay, let's go on with networking. Any more time at the end, we can talk about storage.
In Rev 3.0, you can configure everything you want to do on a host from the management. So you don't need to go at host level and tweak with network configurations. You want to configure a bond, you can do it from the user interface. You can want to configure logical networks, everything you can do from the user interface, but you had to do it one network at a time. In 3.1, we added a UI that allows you to change all the configurations of the network and send them once to the host. So you can do a bit more sophisticated things that were harder to do before, like moving the management network itself to be on top of a bond, things that to get in 3.0 required multiple steps and were hard to do. Now you can do them in a single step. So we can do things like drag and drop this logical network over here to be on that interface. Or if you want to bond, you'll drag and drop, this interface over that one. They'll be, ask you what type of bond you want to configure. You'll specify the parameters you want for the bond. Now you have a bond, and now we can drag and drop blue and red on top of it and get that. We'll send it to the host once you'll tell us to, and the host will reconfigure its networking, go back up, and make sure that the manager revm still continues to poll it. If it won't poll it, then it will roll back because maybe we misconfigured our network. That's the most important part when configuring a host. If you lost the network to it, sometimes someone needs to drive far away to fix that. So we always roll back if post-configuration we don't see the engine polling us after that. We added a few more features in networking. We have, now when you're defining a network, you can define if that network is going to run virtual machines on it. Sometimes you want to configure a network on the host, not for the virtual machines, but maybe for the management only, or for your storage access, for NFS or iSCSI. And if it's not going to run virtual machines, we're not going to define a software bridge on it, so you'll get a bit of a better performance using it. Another way to get better performance introduced in 3.1 is to use jumbo frames, larger packets going on the network. You can now set the MTU, the size of the packets allowed. If you want to do this, all the nodes and switches at this layer 2 network must support this MTU setting. But once you configure that, you're going to see improved performance. When we configure the host with the networks, we also monitor that. In 3.0, all networks were required. So if one of your logical networks was down, we would consider that host non-operational, migrate the virtual machines to another host to make sure they are served. In 3.1, you can define some of the logical networks as less critical, as not required. So you'll still be using that host for other virtual machines, even if it lost some of its network. So you get a bit more flexibility on how to, the priority between your logical networks and the way you consider your host to be used. Port mirroring. Port mirroring allows you to configure a virtual machine to get all the traffic of other virtual machines on that host, on that logical network to it, also sometimes called promiscuous mode. It sniffs all the network and use it. Why is that good? Because sometimes you want to run an intrusion detection system on a virtual appliance, on a virtual machine. You put one on each host. They need to monitor the traffic going onto those virtual machines to be able to alert you that someone is attacking them. So this is based on port mirroring. Obviously, it's a bit of privileged operation to say, for this virtual machine, I want to listen to other virtual machine traffics. So this requires a special permission to use it. This is per host, yes. The mirroring is per host. If you want to do, for example, intrusion detection, you need to put a virtual appliance on each host in your system. Similar to hot plug disk, hot plug NIC, you can now add a virtual NIC to a virtual machine while it's running, activate, deactivate it, remove, add, etc. For virtual NICs as well, similar to virtual disks.
Do we change the network in 3.1 that the NIC is assigned to while it's running?
You can remove it. You can remove it entirely and add another one if you want with a different logical network. So that solved that. Sorry. Can you change the VLAN?
So, like he was saying, I found it this was done. I suppose you can do it, but from the managers, or it would allow you to say, this is no longer on the red VLAN, it's now on the green VLAN. Go.
So what you can do is you can deactivate the virtual NIC, change it, and activate it
Or
back.
you could add another virtual NIC that was inactive and then go through the status.
Yeah.
So there's a.
But you can do it now when the virtual machine is running, which you couldn't do before because it's hot plug.
We don't have a low-level feature right now in libvirt to be able to dynamically change a NIC that's assigned to a VM. That's actually coming. But Bhavna can keep me honest, but I think it's a 6.4 feature in libvirt, so then it's probably good leverage.
Any other networking questions? Okay.
I'm going to cheat and actually reuse some slides from last year because this is my favorite feature. And when we get questions about, do you support this? And the answer is no. And someone says, well, KVM does that and libvirt does that. So how do we give you more features while we're still developing the UI and the management framework around those? The idea is a hook feature to allow us to have user exits or hook points on the VM lifecycle so I can customize the VM's configuration. So looking at the flow, we've got the backend engine inside Rev communicating to VDSM. VDSM communicates to libvirt to start a VM, which then works with the host in KVM. So the hooks actually sit in between VDSM and libvirt. The idea is at some point I want to intercept a call to libvirt. I want to change the libvirt configuration. I want to add a new property, remove something. I want to do something before we run a lifecycle action. So when can I do these hooks? What are the actions that I can trap? So when the management agent starts, just before VM starts, just after it starts, and typically you do these things on the before VM start action. You have a script that can run, that can modify the configuration. Actually, in 3.1, we added a new hook, which is VM set ticket is when you're doing a console connection to a VM. We can take some action before or after we authorize and set a ticket for a console connection. So how do you write a hook? So a hook is, well, I'd recommend it's in Python because it shouldn't be in Perl, but a hook is a script that runs, and it's given some properties. It's given the VM's configuration as an XML document, and then it can make any calls outside. But we can also pass specific properties per VM. So this is on a VM's advanced options. You get something called custom properties, and you define a property. So for example, we have one called SAP agent. If that property is set to true, that flag gets passed to a specific hook that does something if the hook is installed and if that property is set to true. And if you look at the node, you'll see a set of directories, and it's a bit like the kind of .d conf directories. So for each directory, I might have a script in there on the before VM start, and all the scripts are run in order. The management system will list in each of the hosts what hooks are installed. So then VDSM is told to run a VM. It's passed the VM's configuration and the custom properties. It then passes that libvirt XML definition to the hook script. The hook messes with it, makes a change, maybe even rejects the operation, and then passes that XML to libvirt. So, trivial example, I want to have a watchdog, an emulated hardware watchdog. I don't have that checkbox in the UI. So I could write a hook which looks for a particular key, watchdog, and if that key, that custom property is set, we're basically going to munge the XML. We're going to hooking library. I think something was lost in translation. So, using this porting name library, we're going to read the XML, pass to the virtual machine. We're going to look for a specific tag and then add the watchdog. So again, very simple to change the configuration. So we have a lot of hooks for 3.0 that customers use that go away in 3.1. We had a hook for direct LAN, a hook for CPU pinning, and a whole series of hooks that we could support in libvirt, but we couldn't support in Rev. So my goal is that hooks die because I have all the features in the UI. In the meantime, when we have a question, how do I do this? Well, I've got a hook for SRIOV, where you can specify the VF function you want to assign to a VM. Any questions on hooks? Going to go quickly through this, and we're running out of time. So quotas is a new feature we added to 3.1. So the idea is that you can define in a user to use access on VMs or on clusters to create their own virtual machines. And you've got this user portal, or this power user portal, depending on your role, where I could give the QA team access to a group of resources, typically a set of VMs. But if I let them create their own VMs, they could create 1,000, 100 VMs. So I want to limit how many virtual machines they could create or how many they could actually run. So the quota allows us to limit how much storage space a user can allocate, how many virtual CPUs they can run, and how much memory they can run. So I could have 1,000 VMs, each with one virtual CPU. If my quota says 50 virtual CPUs, as long as I run 50, I'm fine. So the enforcement for CPU and memory is at runtime, and for storage, it's what you allocate on the array itself. So there's a new tab in the UI for quotas, and you can configure multiple quotas. So a quota could be something just given to a user. So user Andy gets this many virtual CPUs and this much RAM and storage. But maybe I'm part of the engineering team. And so the engineering team has their own quota as well. So I can have multiple quotas that can be applied to an individual user. Yes?
Do you do quotas based on order allocation ratio?
Can you do quotas based on, can you expand the question?
Say I have a storage domain that is 1 terabyte in size. I want to make sure that my users don't go over that oversubscription.
Got it.
By 10 or 1.
So for, if you have a thinly provisioned VM, and then its physical size, it may be using 500 gigabytes today, but its logical size is 2 terabytes. So the question would be, how do you measure that? For the quotas, we measure its full capacity, not what you're using today, but if it's thinly provisioned and the logical size is 2 terabytes, we count it as 2 terabytes, even if it's only using less when it's thinly provisioned. I'm going to be really quick, we're going to run out of time. So you can have multiple quotas assigned to a user. So if you have groups, it's almost like having a credit card system. I've got multiple cards. Do I pay for this virtual machine using my personal card or my corporate card? So multiple quotas can match to different levels of tenancy. It's something that can be enabled at the data center level. And there's 3 modes: disabled, off altogether, audit. So you just see what's being used, but there's no enforcement. So you may want to run in audit mode for the first few weeks, make sure you've got your quotas right. You don't want that call at 3 a.m. And enforce means that you're going to block operations if you would violate your quota. I think based on time, let's just skip to Q&A for the last 5 minutes. Yes?
Is there a way to have like custom tags or something to use with scripting on the...
So we have this notion of custom property. So you can define a property. Now,
that's not necessarily path of flow.
no, but so that can be, you can use it for a description, from an asset tag, for anything you want, and then put in that. Yes?
So, have you guys thought about either a code installer or a web-driven initial walkthrough, non-Linux users defining what's up, too complicated?
So the question, have you thought of something that's kind of a more non-Linux savvy user? So we try to make it as simple as possible with the questions. I mean, it's yes, yes, no, fiber channel. We've looked, or we've discussed having a web UI for the installer. I think what may be more interesting is having an appliance for the manager than having, if you either install it yourself any way you want to install it, or have a VM that's shipped as your rev, which is more likely. Yes. MPIV, we can do that with a hook. It's not in the UI today. When we come to support Virtual SCSI, that becomes very relevant. Yes.
The ID for the storage and ISCSI LAN or MC LAN. So are those ID wave-generated IDs or something else?
The IDs for the SCSI. So
That are shown in the storage tab.
So we have a UUID for a disk. So that's something that we generate ourselves. But if you're doing a direct LAN, we have our reference pointed to it, but then we also have the WWID, which is the real pointer to the disk.
So that particular ID will remain same across hosts?
The WWID, yes, that will do between hosts, yes. Yes.
Will NPIV be supported now?
Yeah, when we move to the Virtual SCSI model, then we'll need to bring MPIV with it. You could do that with a hook today, but it's not in the UI. Yes? Okay, I think the question was, can you overcommit virtual CPUs? So the maximum virtual CPUs we can support in RHEL 6.3, for example, is 160 for a single VM. But the limit is you should not commit more virtual CPUs for a single VM than you have cores on a host. So let's say I've got a 64-core virtual machine. I can run 500 if I wanted to, or even more VMs with virtual cores, but a single VM can't be more than 64. So single VM is limited to how many cores, not threads, cores on the host, but the combination you can have many more than the physical number of cores across VMs. Let's just do one more question, and then after that we've got a small break before there's an architecture session. We're going to go like a level even deeper with LivNat, but yeah, one more question.
What was the Red Hat virtual machine that's how they know?
I don't know engineering, I'm going to say that. So the question was, when can we get RevM as a virtual machine managed by the Rev infrastructure? I can tell you it's not in 3.1. We're going into planning for the 3.2 development cycle now. That's very high on the list. Had that question in the previous session, so I believe that should be a 3.2 feature, but we've got to ask engineering.
We'll negotiate offline.
So, okay, we've got I think a 10-minute break before LivNat's really deep dive into architecture. If you've got any questions, there's a bunch of the Rev team here, KVM team as well. Please come to the front, any questions you've got. If not, we'll see you on the next session.